The evening had started with such promise. We had been planning this dinner for weeks, and for once I was optimistic that everything would go smoothly. The table was set, each plate gleaming, and the faint smell of garlic, rosemary, and freshly baked bread filled the air. My wife, ever the perfectionist, had worked tirelessly to make sure her mother's birthday dinner would be unforgettable. It was meant to be a celebration, a rare opportunity to bring the family together and create a peaceful atmosphere. But from the moment her mother stepped through the door, I knew that this night would be anything but peaceful. I had always known that my relationship with my wife's mother was complicated, but I had hoped time would soften the tension between us. It wasn't that I disliked her, not exactly. She had a way of making me feel inadequate, as though I could never meet her standards, no matter how hard I tried. She often made it clear that she didn't think I was good enough for her daughter, and over the years, I had learned to bite my tongue and grin and bear it. But tonight was supposed to be different. It was her birthday, after all, and I wanted to be on my best behavior. I wanted to make things right. As she entered the house, I tried to stand a little taller to appear more confident. I greeted her with a smile, though it was hard to ignore the icy look in her eyes. She nodded stiffly, acknowledging my presence but not much else. My wife greeted her mother with the kind of warmth that only a daughter could muster, and I could see the small flicker of relief in her eyes as she embraced her mother. That warmth wasn't something I had ever been able to replicate with her. It was clear that their bond was deep, and I often found myself standing on the outside looking in. The dinner was laid out before us: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, a salad bursting with fresh vegetables, and a decadent chocolate cake for dessert. My wife had spared no expense, carefully selecting the ingredients and preparing each dish with meticulous attention. She had even arranged a beautiful bouquet of flowers in the center of the table, the soft pinks and whites adding a touch of elegance to the room. Everything had been planned down to the smallest detail, but it was hard to ignore the tension that hung in the air, as thick as the steam rising from the plates. We all sat down, my wife beside me and her mother across the table. I noticed her mother's gaze darting to me every now and then, a look of disapproval in her eyes. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or if she truly couldn't hide her contempt. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I was here for my wife, to support her, to make this a special evening for her mother. But with every passing second, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. The meal began in silence, punctuated only by the sound of silverware clinking against porcelain. I couldn't help but feel out of place, as though I was intruding on a moment that didn't quite belong to me. My wife's laughter echoed in the room as she and her mother reminisced about old times, and I found myself drifting in and out of the conversation, unsure of my place in the dynamic. I had always been the outsider in their relationship, the one who didn't fully understand the history they shared. It wasn't that I was unwelcome. It was just that I had never been able to fully break through the walls that her mother had built around her. As the evening wore on, the tension seemed to rise. It wasn't overt, it didn't crackle in the air like a storm waiting to break, but it was there beneath the surface, simmering just out of sight. I could feel it, though, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. I tried to focus on my meal, but every glance from my wife's mother made me feel smaller, less important. I caught myself checking the clock more than once, wishing the evening would end soon. But no matter how much I wanted to escape, I was trapped in that moment, stuck at a table with two people who, despite their close bond, made me feel like an outsider in my own home. Then the incident happened. It was so small, so insignificant, that at first I didn't think anything of it. I had just finished helping my wife clear the dishes from the table when I noticed that the salad bowl had been left on the edge, just out of reach. I wasn't sure if it was intentional or if it was simply forgotten, but I figured I would pass by and give it a quick nudge to the center so no one had to stretch to get more. I had no idea that this innocent gesture would set off a chain of events I wasn't prepared for. As I walked past my wife's mother to reach the salad, I brushed against her elbow. It wasn't much, a light brush, a small inadvertent bump. But it was enough. I could feel her body tense immediately, and the look she shot me made my blood run cold. I stopped in my tracks, startled by the sudden shift in her demeanor. Her lips tightened into a thin, hard line, and for the first time that evening her coldness was palpable. It was as if I had violated some unspoken rule, some line I hadn't even known existed. Before I could even open my mouth to apologize, her hand shot out, faster than I had anticipated, and slapped me across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the room like a thunderclap. It was sharp, unforgiving, and I stood frozen, my hand instinctively touching my cheek where the sting burned. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts racing, but my body was still paralyzed by the shock. It wasn't just the physical sting of the slap that left me speechless. It was the sheer disbelief of it. In all our years of marriage, in all the moments of tension and discomfort, I had never once expected this. My wife gasped, her eyes wide with surprise and confusion, but her mother didn't even look at her. She turned to me with a sneer, her eyes filled with disdain. "You're always in the way," she spat. Her voice was low, but I could hear the venom in every word. "I should have known you would ruin this evening, just like you ruin everything else." The words hit harder than the slap itself. I felt a knot of anger twist in my stomach, but I didn't know how to respond. What could I say to that? How could I defend myself when she had already made up her mind about who I was? In that moment, everything I had worked for, the years of patience, the efforts to get along with her, seemed pointless. It didn't matter what I did, how I tried to be the man my wife needed, because in her eyes, I was always going to be the one who didn't belong. My wife reached out for me, her voice soft and panicked, but I could hardly hear her. My mind was spinning. The pain in my cheek, the humiliation in my chest, the sudden wave of fury that flooded through me, I didn't know how to handle it. All I wanted to do was escape, to run out of the room and never look back. But I couldn't. Not without causing a scene, not without making things even worse than they already were. And that was when I realized, with a sickening certainty, that this dinner, the one that was supposed to bring us together, was only going to tear us apart. The room seemed to shrink around me after her hand made contact with my cheek. The sting from the slap wasn't the worst part. It was the sudden, suffocating silence that followed. It felt as though time itself had frozen, and I was trapped in this excruciating moment. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Everything inside me was in turmoil. I could hear my wife's sharp intake of breath, a gasp that cut through the stillness like a blade. But even that seemed distant, as if the sound had been muted by the weight of the tension in the room. My mind raced, but my body felt frozen in place, the shock of the slap holding me captive. My hand instinctively went to my cheek, where the sensation of the slap still lingered, a red-hot burn beneath my fingertips. But I couldn't react. I didn't know what to do, what to say. This wasn't just a slap. It was an act of aggression, something more than just a physical reaction to a mere bump. There was so much more behind it. Her mother's face was twisted with disdain, her lips drawn tight in a scowl that seemed to deepen with every passing second. She didn't even seem to notice or care that my wife was now standing there, her face pale with shock, her eyes darting between her mother and me. I could feel the weight of her gaze, but it didn't seem to matter. My wife's distress was secondary to the storm that raged in her mother's eyes. The slap had been quick, sudden, an explosion of rage that came out of nowhere. But now, in the silence that followed, it felt like a slow burn, an aftermath that left me reeling. The air in the room was thick with unresolved tension, a pressure that felt unbearable. I wanted to say something, to fight back, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. There was no explanation, no justification that could make sense of this. I had always known her mother didn't like me. That wasn't a surprise. The disdain had been there for as long as I could remember, a constant undercurrent to every interaction we had. But this felt different. This wasn't just a mother disapproving of her daughter's choice in a partner. This was something deeper, something more violent. It was a power struggle, a reminder of who was in control, a stark message that I wasn't welcome, that I didn't belong in her world. The room felt cold now, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of it in an instant. The beautiful dinner my wife had so carefully prepared, the one that was meant to bring us all together, was now a backdrop to something far darker. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the sense of shame, the humiliation that crawled through my veins. I wanted to look at my wife to see her reaction, but I couldn't bring myself to face her. The weight of the slap still lingered, both physically and emotionally. and the shame gnawed at me like an insidious presence, forcing me to avert my gaze. I couldn't meet her eyes. I couldn't face the hurt I saw in her face, the disbelief, the confusion. She was still standing there, her body frozen in shock, unsure of what to do. I saw her reach out as if to comfort me, but she stopped short, her fingers trembling in the air, unsure of what to say. Unsure of how to fix this moment that had shattered everything. I could feel the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders were hunched as though she were bracing herself for something worse. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't my fault, that I hadn't meant to cause this, that her mother had overreacted. But the words felt hollow in my throat, like they would only make things worse. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? How could I explain why her mother had reacted so violently, so harshly? I couldn't even make sense of it. Her mother stood across from me, her eyes narrowed, lips twisted into a cruel sneer. It wasn't the first time I had seen that look. The disdain, the disapproval, the belief that I wasn't worthy of her daughter. But this was the first time it had escalated to violence. This was the first time her anger had manifested in such an overt, physical way. And in that moment, I realized that all the years of trying to make peace, of trying to earn her approval, had been in vain. Nothing would ever be enough. My wife, on the other hand, was caught in the middle. I could see the turmoil in her face, the way she looked back and forth between her mother and me. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to fix this, how to reconcile the love she had for both of us in the face of such an open act of aggression. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault. I wanted to reach out and pull her into my arms, to reassure her that everything would be okay. But I didn't feel okay. I didn't know how to make it okay. The room was suffocating now, the silence heavy and oppressive. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a family dinner, where people could enjoy each other's company, bask in the warmth of shared stories. This silence felt thick with anger, with unresolved issues that had finally boiled over. I could almost feel the weight of everything that had been unsaid between her mother and me, all the resentment that had built up over the years. It was all laid bare in that moment, like a wound that had finally been exposed. Her mother's eyes remained fixed on me, her anger palpable, her face devoid of any remorse. I couldn't look at her any longer. The humiliation, the shame, the sense of helplessness, it was too much to bear. I couldn't understand why this was happening, why it had to escalate like this. I could hear my wife's voice now, faint, distant, as she tried to calm her mother down, but it was no use. Her mother wasn't interested in calming down. She wasn't interested in hearing anything I had to say. All she wanted was to assert her power, to make sure I knew my place in her world. And in that moment, I realized something painful, something I had known but never fully understood. Her anger wasn't just about me. It was about her own sense of loss, her fear that her daughter had grown up, had moved away from her control. From the life she had envisioned for her, it was about her inability to accept that her daughter had a life outside of her. And for that, I was the scapegoat. I stood there, feeling the weight of her hatred pressing down on me, suffocating me. The dinner, the family gathering, had turned into something unrecognizable. The warmth of the evening had been replaced by a bitter chill that wrapped itself around me, keeping me trapped in this unbearable moment. And then, in the silence, I felt the smallest flicker of something inside me, a deep, burning anger that I hadn't realized was there. It wasn't directed at my wife, who was just as much a victim in this situation as I was. It wasn't directed at the dinner, or even at her mother, who was consumed by her own bitterness. It was directed at myself. I was angry at myself for letting things get this far. I was angry at myself for thinking that, for one moment, I could have peace with her mother, for believing that tonight might be different. I wanted to escape. I wanted to run far away from the suffocating tension, from the anger and the hatred that filled the room. But I couldn't. I was trapped, just like I had been trapped in this toxic dynamic for years. And as much as I wanted to break free, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. In that moment, as the seconds stretched into eternity, I knew that everything had changed. The dinner, the relationships, the fragile peace I had been holding onto for so long, it was all gone. And I was left standing in the ruins, trying to figure out what had just happened, and how I would move forward. The sting from the slap still lingered on my cheek, a burning reminder of the fury that had just erupted. But the pain was nothing compared to the weight of the humiliation that seemed to follow me, pressing down on my shoulders. My body was still frozen in shock, my hands trembling at my sides, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me had tilted off its axis. Everything that had been so carefully built between us, me, my wife, and her mother, had just shattered in an instant. Her mother stood there, towering over me with a look of contempt still etched on her face. Her lips were tight, drawn into a thin line, as if she were savoring the moment of power she had seized. The fury in her eyes was palpable, as if she had been waiting for this moment, this opportunity to assert her control. And in that brief, violent exchange, she had succeeded. She had made it clear that I was nothing but a thorn in her side, something to be discarded and pushed aside. But the worst was yet to come. As I stood there, still reeling from the shock of the slap, I saw her move. It wasn't a sudden movement, it was deliberate, measured. She stepped forward, her face still twisted with anger, her eyes never leaving mine. For a moment I thought she might say something to further justify what she had done, but her words were never uttered. Instead, she took another step, and before I could even react, she kicked me. It wasn't a gentle nudge, a momentary jolt that could be brushed off. No, this was deliberate, forceful. Her foot connected with my shin, with an intensity that made me stumble backward. The impact sent a shockwave of pain up my leg, and I struggled to keep my balance, my body rocking on the edge of the table as my arms flailed for support. The sharpness of the kick reverberated through my body, the pain coursing up my leg as though my entire being had been jolted awake from a long, dizzying daze. I stumbled, my foot slipping awkwardly as the sharp edge of the table pressed against my back. It took every ounce of my concentration to remain upright, to avoid falling to the floor. But as much as I fought to regain my balance, I couldn't ignore the shock of what had just happened. I had been kicked, not just by anyone but by my wife's mother, the woman who had always made her feelings clear but who had never crossed the line like this before. The room seemed to spin as I took in the reality of it all. Her mother didn't just slap me, she kicked me. It was as though she were trying to physically eject me from her world, to force me to leave. And in a way, she had succeeded. I felt smaller than ever before, humiliated and reduced to nothing more than a target for her anger. My wife stood there, paralyzed by the scene unfolding before her. I could see her eyes wide with disbelief, her lips parted in shock, as though she didn't know how to process what had just happened. She had been as blindsided as I was, her mother's aggression coming out of nowhere, catching both of us off guard. But what struck me most was the helplessness in her gaze. She had never seen her mother act this way, never witnessed the cruelty that had just spilled forth. And I could see the struggle in her face, torn between the love for her mother and the man she had chosen to marry. How could I expect her to choose between us now, when everything had erupted in such a violent explosion of emotion? The air was thick with tension, suffocating and heavy, and for a moment I thought I might suffocate under its weight. My body still trembled from the impact of the kick, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped, pinned down by forces that were beyond my control. Her mother had made it clear that night that she held all the power, that she could make me feel small and insignificant, that she could break me in an instant. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to say something, anything, to defend myself, to assert my presence, to remind her that I was a person, not just some punching bag for her misplaced anger. But the words wouldn't come. It was as if my throat had closed up, my voice stolen by the shock of the situation. I looked over at my wife, hoping to find some sort of solace in her eyes, but all I saw was a look of sheer helplessness. She was just as lost as I was, trapped in this whirlwind of emotion and violence. Her mother, the woman who had raised her, who she had always looked up to, was now the one who had caused this rift. And I could see the weight of that realization settling into my wife's expression, her confusion turning to sorrow and eventually to frustration. How could she fix this? How could she ever make sense of this sudden and violent turn of events? But I couldn't wait for her to fix it. I couldn't keep standing there like some passive observer, waiting for her to come to my defense. No, I had to do something, had to break free from the suffocating grip of this situation. I needed to stand up for myself, to regain some semblance of dignity after everything that had happened. I took a deep breath, fighting back the pain in my leg, and stood up straight. My muscles were stiff, and my body felt heavy, like it had been weighed down by the shock of it all. I wanted to leave. I wanted to walk out of that house, out of that room, and never look back. But something inside me wouldn't let me. I couldn't just walk away. Not yet. I glanced at my wife again, and for the first time I saw the pain in her eyes. She wasn't angry with me. No, she was angry at the situation, angry that this was happening, angry that her mother had crossed a line she never thought possible. But it wasn't enough to ease the sense of betrayal I felt. This was the woman I had tried so hard to appease, to build a relationship with, and she had reduced me to nothing more than an object to be discarded. Her mother hadn't just hurt me physically. She had wounded my sense of self, my place in the family, my place in my wife's life. And it hurt in ways that I couldn't even begin to explain. The pain in my shin was nothing compared to the emotional toll that had been taken on me. I had been humiliated, belittled, and tossed aside with a flick of her foot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. I couldn't look at my wife anymore. I couldn't stand the thought of her seeing me like this, unable to protect myself, unable to defend her against the force of her mother's anger. The woman who was supposed to accept me, to welcome me into her family, had made it clear that I was nothing more than an intruder, someone unworthy of her daughter's love. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers. But all I could do was stand there, feeling the weight of it all settle into the pit of my stomach, knowing that the night had been irrevocably altered. The dinner that was supposed to bring us closer had torn us apart. The calm, controlled world I had tried so hard to create had been shattered by a single slap and a kick, leaving nothing but the raw remnants of a broken family. And all I could do was stand there, trying to gather the strength to survive the aftermath. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were slowly closing in around me, pushing me into a corner where there was no escape. I had just been kicked, not in the figurative sense. No, this was a brutal physical reminder of how far things had fallen. My wife's mother had laid her hands on me twice with a force that I hadn't expected. A slap followed by a kick. A direct assault on my dignity and my place in this family. And in the aftermath, the silence was overwhelming, pressing against me from all sides. I could still feel the sting on my face where the slap had landed, the pain on my shin from where her foot had struck. But the physical pain wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the sense of helplessness that weighed on me. I couldn't fight back. I couldn't say anything to make it better. The anger inside me burned hot, but I couldn't release it. The power dynamics had shifted, and I was left standing there, humiliated and stunned, with no way to fix what had just happened. I looked at my wife, but I couldn't meet her eyes. I couldn't bear to see the mixture of shock and confusion on her face. She had seen me take that slap, heard the crack of her mother's voice, and yet she was just as powerless in that moment as I was. I could feel her pain, her helplessness, but I couldn't expect her to fix this. It wasn't something she could fix. It wasn't something any of us could fix. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. My legs were stiff, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel my body shaking with the aftershocks of the chaos that had just erupted. I was trying to gather myself, trying to steady my breath and my thoughts, but it was impossible. I couldn't think clearly. Everything was clouded by the overwhelming surge of emotions that had just exploded in the room. But then a thought pierced through the fog in my mind. The truth of the situation. It wasn't just about the slap or the kick. It wasn't just about my humiliation or the violence that had been thrust upon me. It was about the fractured family dynamic that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. This moment, this outburst from her mother, was just the manifestation of something deeper, something more painful. The years of tension, of unspoken resentment had built up to this point. I had been a part of their family for a long time, but I had never truly been accepted by her mother. I had tried over and over again to gain her approval. I had gone out of my way to be respectful, to be understanding, to be the kind of son-in-law she would be proud of, but it was never enough. No matter how hard I tried, there was always something about me that she couldn't accept. She didn't want me in her daughter's life. She didn't want me in their family. And now it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the toll this had taken on my wife. I had never realized how much her mother's behavior had affected her until now. I had always thought it was something that we could push through, something we could ignore, but it was. It had shaped my wife's life, shaped her relationship with her mother, and now it was shaping her relationship with me. I had tried to ignore it. I had tried to brush it off as just her being difficult. But now, with the slap still burning on my cheek and the kick still stinging in my shin, I realized that I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just about me, it was about the two of us. It was about our future, our marriage, and the family we were trying to build together. I took a deep breath, my body still trembling, and finally I turned to look at my wife. I couldn't avoid her anymore. The pain in her eyes cut through me like a knife, and I felt a pang of guilt deep in my chest. She had seen me be humiliated in front of her mother, had seen her mother lash out at me, and yet I had nothing to offer her in return. I had no answers, no solutions. I couldn't protect her from the reality that we were now facing. I couldn't fix what had been broken. Her mother's anger wasn't just directed at me, it was directed at her too. I could see that now. My wife had always been caught in the middle of their relationship, torn between her loyalty to her mother and her love for me. But tonight it had escalated beyond what we had ever experienced. Her mother had drawn a line in the sand, and I was on the wrong side of it. There was no way around it anymore, no more pretending that things were okay. I could feel the anger rising inside me again, but this time, it wasn't just about defending myself. It was about the betrayal I felt. It was about the years of trying to make things work with her mother, only to be slapped down at every turn. It was about the realization that I had been fighting a battle I could never win. Her mother didn't want me here. She never had. And no matter how much I tried to be the man her daughter needed, it would never be enough for her. I glanced around the room, trying to steady myself, trying to find something that would give me the strength to move forward. The table was still set, the dinner still sitting there, untouched, a cruel reminder of what should have been a peaceful evening. The flowers in the center of the table, the gleaming silverware, the empty glasses, they all felt so meaningless now. Everything had been reduced to this. The mess of emotions, the fractured relationships, the hurt that hung thick in the air. My eyes returned to my wife. She was still standing there, her hands trembling at her sides, her face pale with shock and sadness. She hadn't moved since the moment her mother had slapped me. I could see the strain in her expression, the struggle to understand what had just happened. And I could see the guilt, too. Guilt that she had been unable to stop her mother, guilt that she hadn't been able to protect me from her mother's rage. But the truth was, she couldn't have stopped it. She couldn't have prevented this moment, no matter how hard she tried. Her mother's anger had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with her own fears, her own insecurities, her inability to accept the reality that her daughter had grown up, that she had a life outside of her control. And I was a symbol of that life, a reminder of everything her mother could never control. I took a step closer to her, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, that we could fix this. But I couldn't. There was no fixing this, not tonight. Not when the wounds had been laid bare for both of us to see. I reached for her hand, but she pulled back, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She didn't know what to say. Neither of us did. We were both lost in the aftermath of something we couldn't understand, something we couldn't fix. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't take back the slap or the kick, and I couldn't undo the damage that had been done. All I could do was stand there, in the wreckage of everything I had tried to build, and try to make sense of it all. But deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The hours that followed the confrontation seemed to blur together, each minute stretching into eternity. The pain in my shin and the throbbing on my cheek had dulled, but the emotional bruising was something I couldn't shake. I had been physically assaulted by my wife's mother, slapped and kicked, and it was like the world had cracked open around me. All the walls I had built, the ones that had kept my dignity intact, had crumbled away in an instant. And now I was left standing in the wreckage, unsure of what to do next, unsure of where to go from here. I stood in the dimly lit hallway, my hands clenched at my sides, trying to steady myself. I had tried to hold everything together, tried to remain calm for my wife, but I could feel the cracks widening in the foundation of everything I had built. Her mother had made her position clear. I wasn't welcome. I was the problem. I was the one who didn't belong. It was all so painful to confront. I had spent years trying to gain her approval, trying to prove myself worthy of her daughter's love. But now, in the wake of the slap, I realized how futile it all was. It wasn't about me. It never had been. It was about her mother's deep-seated fears, her insecurities, her need to control everything around her. And I had become the target of that control. I looked down at my hands, seeing them shake slightly, and I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. This wasn't just about her mother's anger toward me. It was about something deeper, something that had been festering for years. It was about her fear of losing her daughter, her need to hold on to a version of her life that no longer existed. My wife had grown up. She had made choices that her mother didn't approve of. She had moved forward, created a life of her own, and I, for better or worse, had become part of that life. But I wasn't the real problem. I wasn't the one her mother was angry with. I was just the one who had been caught in the crossfire. I turned away from the hallway and walked toward the kitchen. I needed to clear my head. I needed space. My thoughts were swirling, and I had no idea how to process everything that had just happened. The confrontation at dinner had torn open something that I had kept buried for a long time. The truth of what my wife's mother really thought of me, and more importantly, the truth of how deeply my wife had been affected by it all. I couldn't blame her. How could I? She had grown up in the shadow of her mother's overbearing presence. She had spent her entire life trying to please her mother, trying to be the daughter she wanted. And now, with me in the picture, that balance had been disrupted. Her mother had never fully accepted me, never fully welcomed me into their family, and my wife had lived with that for years. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. My wife had been carrying this burden for so long, trying to navigate between her love for me and her loyalty to her mother. She had been forced to choose between us, and no matter what choice she made, someone was always going to be hurt. It was an impossible situation, one that had been set in motion long before I ever came into the picture. But now, in the wake of her mother's outburst, everything was laid bare. I had always known that my relationship with my wife's mother was strained, but I hadn't fully understood the depth of it. I hadn't realized how much it had impacted my wife, how much it had affected the way she saw me, the way she saw herself. She had spent so many years trying to make her mother happy, trying to please her, trying to make peace between the two worlds. And in the process, she had sacrificed so much of herself. She had become a mediator, a bridge between two conflicting forces, never truly able to live her own life without the shadow of her mother's expectations hanging over her. But now, with everything that had happened, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. My wife was trapped in the middle of a war that wasn't hers to fight. She was trying to hold everything together, her love for me, her loyalty to her mother, her desire for peace, but the strain was becoming too much. And I couldn't keep pretending that it wasn't affecting us, that it wasn't affecting her. I couldn't keep pretending that I wasn't just as much a part of the problem as her mother was. I stood in the kitchen, my hands resting on the counter, my mind racing. I could hear the faint sound of my wife moving in the other room, her footsteps tentative, as though she were unsure of where to go or what to do next. I had to talk to her. I had to make her understand that I didn't want to be the cause of this rift. I didn't want to be the one who tore her between the two people she loved most in the world. But I didn't know how to start. I didn't know where to begin. I needed to make sense of it all first. I needed to understand how I had let myself get caught up in this, how I had allowed my own frustrations and insecurities to build up over time, until they had boiled over into something this ugly. But most of all, I needed to understand how I could fix it. How I could fix the damage that had been done. How I could rebuild the trust that had been shattered in a single, violent moment. I glanced toward the living room, where my wife had settled onto the couch. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, her posture stiff and tense, as though she were bracing for something. I couldn't keep running away from this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. She deserved more than that. She deserved someone who could stand by her, who could help her navigate this mess. And I had to be that person. I had to be the one who stepped up, who took responsibility for my part in all of this, who acknowledged the pain that had been caused, not just to me, but to her and to the fragile bond between us. I walked toward the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. This wasn't just about the slap or the kick. This was about years of unresolved tension, years of things left unsaid, years of pain that had never been fully addressed. But it was also about the future, about how we could move forward, how we could heal. I took a deep breath and sat down next to my wife. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the exhaustion in them, the emotional toll this had taken on her. She was worn out, drained by the fight she had been carrying for so long. And in that moment I realized something. I wasn't the only one who needed to heal. We both did. We both needed to confront the truth of what had happened, what was happening, and what it all meant for us. And we needed to face it together. I sat there beside her, the room silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to press down on me, harder with each passing second. I could feel the tension between us, thick and suffocating. She was sitting beside me, but it felt as though there was an invisible chasm between us. The distance between us was no longer physical, it was emotional, a gulf that seemed impossible to cross. I wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. How could I promise her that things would be okay when everything felt so broken? How could I give her the reassurance she needed when I didn't even have the answers for myself? My wife had always been the pillar of strength, the one who held everything together, even when it felt like the world was falling apart. But now, she was the one who needed support. She was the one who needed someone to help her make sense of this situation. And I had no idea how to be that person. I looked at her, but she wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the floor, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes red from the tears she had shed earlier. She was so still, so quiet, as though she was lost in her thoughts, unsure of what to do next. I could feel the heaviness of her silence, the weight of the emotions that she was carrying. She was grieving, but I wasn't sure what she was grieving. Was it for the family she had lost, or was it for the part of herself that had been torn away? The silence stretched on, long and uncomfortable. I wanted to say something to break it, to bridge the gap between us, but the words didn't come. I was too consumed by my own thoughts, too overwhelmed by the flood of emotions that had been unleashed. The slap and the kick, the anger in her mother's eyes, they were still fresh in my mind, still reverberating through my body like an echo that wouldn't fade. But the real pain wasn't the physical hurt. It was the realization that we had reached a breaking point. We had reached a moment where everything had to be confronted, or it would all fall apart. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. The anger that had been boiling inside me earlier had dissipated, but now there was something else, something deeper, something I couldn't name. It was a feeling of helplessness, of confusion. I didn't know where to go from here. I didn't know how to fix what had been broken. And then, like a crack in the dam, the truth hit me. I wasn't the only one who had been hurt. My wife had been carrying this burden for years, years of trying to balance her love for me with her loyalty to her mother. Years of walking a tightrope between two worlds that would never meet. Her mother had never accepted me. And in trying to please her mother, my wife had never fully been able to give herself to me, not completely. She had always been caught between the two of us, torn by the expectations of one and the love of the other. It was no wonder she had struggled with the tension between us. She had been living with this invisible weight for so long, trying to please both of us, trying to keep the peace. And all the while, her own needs, her own emotions had been pushed aside. She had never fully confronted the reality of what this had done to her, never fully acknowledged how much it had cost her. I could feel the guilt rising inside me, thick and suffocating. How could I have been so blind? How could I have thought that all of this, the anger, the hostility, the tension, was just something that could be swept under the rug? I had thought that by being patient, by being understanding, I could make things better, but I had failed to see the bigger picture. I had failed to see how deep this pain ran. As I sat there, trying to make sense of everything, I realized that this wasn't just about me and her mother. This was about my wife's entire life, her relationship with her family, her identity, her sense of self. She had been caught in the middle for so long, trying to keep everyone happy, trying to maintain peace, and in doing so, she had sacrificed her own happiness. And now she was paying the price. I reached for her hand, my fingers trembling slightly as I touched hers. I didn't know what I could say, but I knew I couldn't just sit there in silence anymore. I had to try. I had to at least attempt to bridge the distance that had opened up between us. But as soon as I touched her hand, she pulled away. It wasn't a harsh movement, but it was enough to send a sharp pang through my chest. I watched as she curled her hands into fists again, her eyes still fixed on the floor. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to make her see that I wasn't the enemy, that I wasn't the one who had caused all of this. I thought back to everything that had led up to this moment, the years of trying to make her mother happy. The endless attempts to gain her approval, the quiet moments of resentment that had built up between me and my wife's mother. And now it was all laid bare. The truth was ugly and painful, but it was the truth, and we couldn't avoid it any longer. I wanted to tell her that I understood. That I understood how hard it must have been for her, how difficult it must have been to navigate this relationship, to constantly feel like she was failing both of us. I wanted to tell her that I saw her, that I understood her pain, and that I was here ready to help her heal. But the words didn't come. Instead, I just sat there, feeling helpless and lost, knowing that I had to let her process everything in her own time. The silence stretched on, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. It wasn't the kind of silence that was comforting or peaceful. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, with unresolved emotions, with the weight of years of hurt that had never been addressed. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, my wife turned to me. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her face pale and tired, but there was something in her gaze, a softness, a flicker of vulnerability that I hadn't seen before. She didn't say anything at first, but her presence beside me was enough. I didn't need words right then. I just needed to be with her, to be present, to show her that I was still here, even in the face of all this pain. She looked at me for a long time, and I could feel the shift in the room. The tension wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it was different now. The anger that had consumed us both had started to dissipate, replaced by something more fragile, more tentative: hope. A small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could figure this out. That we could heal together, if we were willing to face the truth and confront the damage that had been done. I reached out again, this time more slowly, more cautiously. And this time when I touched her hand, she didn't pull away. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her hand in mine was enough. For now, it was enough. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about the slap or the kick. It wasn't just about the pain and the humiliation I had felt. It was about us. It was about what we had built together and what we had yet to build. It was about the choices we made, the ones we would continue to make, and the ways in which we would learn to heal from this. Together.